Hello, my name is Brad Hyde, and I'm lead pastor at Powell Church here in Powell, Tennessee. And this summer, here in 2021, we are going to be doing a summer sermon series called Mountain Talk. And for this series, I had the opportunity to sit down with a good friend of mine. His name is Charles Maynard. Charles was the director for Friends of the Smokies for 8 years, and he has been a pastor here in East Tennessee for many more years. And I had an opportunity to sit down with Charles in preparation for this series to do an interview with him about Appalachian mountain culture and Appalachian mountain people. So I want to invite you to watch this interview that I get to share in with Charles as we go into this series together.
Well, the Appalachians are very familiar. Geologically, if you look at a geological map and look at the United States on one side and Europe and Africa on the others, the Appalachians were bumped up the same time that the mountains of Scotland and the mountains of Spain and the mountains of West Africa were. So if you go to Scotland and you wander around and you're from here, you feel strangely at home. So it worked the other way, is that people came and the sandy East Coast wasn't like home. And so you get that group moving farther and farther west. Also, the other thing that drove people here is they could own their own land and not work someone else's land. And the English that settled the coast, see, they were from a flatter area in England, so they tended to want that land, and the mountains were a barrier. So you don't really have people crossing the mountains or even getting in the mountains until the mid to late 1700s. So sure, people lived here all along. I mean, the best guess is that people have lived here for about 12,000 years. Which if you were to graph it on a 1 foot ruler and let each inch equal 1,000 years, European contact, not settlement, but contact, doesn't occur till 11.5 inches. And European settlement doesn't occur till 11 3/4. So oftentimes when somebody says, "Oh, tell us about the history of this area," what they're really asking for is the last 1/4 inch. And so there's just this, there's a loss of memory that people lived here for thousands of years and thus knew how to get around. See, Boone, Thomas Walker, their genius was not in finding the routes, it was widening the routes, is making the routes passable for wagons. The routes were already there, had been there for thousands of years. Everybody knew Cumberland Gap, but Boone made it into a road, the Wilderness Road. And so that was his genius. It's not like he walked around in his trackless wilderness. No, he was following the trails that were already here. And so that became easier for people to come in as they were following trails and then that had been widened by people like Boone and Walker and Walton and some of that group. And so consequently you get Scots-Irish, you get the German influence comes down from Pennsylvania and just basically follows the valley down. So they're not so attracted by the mountains as by what the land in the valley was like. So you get those good solid stone barns in Shenandoah Valley, and that's a real German influence. And then the third group that's a real strong group is French Huguenot. And those tended to come into South Carolina and again followed the trails. You came up from South Carolina, came over the mountains into. So Gatlinburg, Sevier County, John Sevier, Sevier, Sevier. I mean, you go read mailboxes in Sevier County, Delosier, Largent, l'argent. I mean, there's that strong influence of French Huguenot. And so all of those kind of locate here because I would argue it was more like home. And they were able to be independent here on their own, which they were not at home. They worked somebody else's land. The interesting thing is there are really two sets of Appalachia. And there's a geological reason for that. The Blue Ridge are the eastern set. The Allegheny Cumberlands are the western. And then there are ranges that cut across the valley sometimes. And you just need to see them as like rungs on a ladder. And that the Allegheny Cumberlands are the west side of that, and the Blue Ridge are the east side. Well, see, the Blue Ridge are very, very old mountains, much older than the Cumberlands and the Alleghenies. And so there's no coal in them. So see, you think of Appalachia, one of the stereotypes is, oh yeah, that's coal mining country. But not if you're on the eastern side of that. And so the western side are much younger, and consequently you have coal. And those got mined, and I mean, we can talk about that more, but that produces almost slightly different cultures because the Blue Ridge culture is one way because it doesn't have that coal legacy. The Allegheny Cumberland culture is slightly different. I guess the example I would give about culture is it's a little bit like describing a group of people as Hispanic, when in reality it's El Salvador and Honduras and Mexico and Peru, and is that there's so many cultures that are a part of that Hispanic grouping, that Latino grouping. And Appalachia's really got some of that same thing. Like I was saying about the Blue Ridge and the Allegheny Cumberlands, there's that. And even from north to south, because, the Appalachians go all the way up to Maine and go down into Alabama and Georgia. Well, even those have kind of differences. I was in the Appalachians in Pennsylvania at a church and a retreat center just a few weeks ago. And there were some things that for me were very much like at home. I mean, but there were other things that I could hear some differences. I mean, obviously the language is different. And you hear a lot of times on a movie or something that people get the accent wrong, that they've been coached to speak Southern as opposed to Appalachian. And there's a very distinct difference there. So, but I would say that one of the things that unites Appalachian culture is a very strong sense of independence. And that's what moonshining was about. It was about, you're not going to tax what I would normally do. That it's easier to move apples and corn by the gallon than it is by the bushel. And it's just corn either way. So why are you taxing this and not that? And so moonshining was really an act of defiance, independence. Well, I'll just go make my own, not have to pay that. And that may be romanticizing moonshining a little bit. But Appalachians, as you come farther south, look at Civil War history, Appalachians were much stronger for the Union than for the Confederacy. So you get a whole section of Virginia that becomes a new state called West Virginia. See, that was all Virginia to start with. But it kind of acknowledged the reality that this part of Virginia has a different culture than the rest of Virginia. East Tennessee, there was the same attempt to break off East Tennessee into a separate state. It's just that the Union never got control of the country enough. But there was a lot of conflict. But again, it was that independent nature of, you're not going to tell me what to do. So I think that's a good marker of Appalachian culture, even up and down the range. I think there's a self-reliance. That independence can be really obstinate and a pain, or you can see it as independence. I mean, we'll talk about cultures more, but I mean, where does country music start? But in the Appalachians. So there's a very distinct, music's a good example, but a very self-reliant. We're just going to make up our own music. We're going to make our own clothing. In other words, the Appalachians are not a manufacturing center. Now, as coal becomes king and gets extracted, it sends to industrial centers. But the big industrial centers are not in the Appalachians, they're outside the Appalachians. So there's that self-reliant that you see in music, and we're going to make our own cloth and clothing. That there wasn't, for years, there was not any, we'll just go down to the store and buy stuff, which you could do in other parts of the country. Now, of course, that's all disappeared, but that vestige still lingers. You still have quiltings. You still have people who get together, and tobacco was king for a long time, and of course it's not. It's gone on its way too. But you work together. Everybody planted over here, and then you planted over there, and you planted over there, and everybody got it all in, and then you helped harvest. But again, the tobacco left Appalachia to go somewhere else. Well, some of my favorite phrases, there was one, my dad grew up in the Cumberlands, and I loved one that I heard some of his relatives use to say, we live so far back in the mountains that we didn't get the Grand Ole Opry till Tuesday, a Saturday show. And the sun didn't rise till 10 and it set at 3, that kind of thing. One time as a pastor, I was making a visit, and I'd been just visiting this older fellow for for a while, and I thought it was an appropriately long visit. And I said, well, I'm gonna have to go. And he said, what'd you come for, a chunk of fire? And I had never heard that before. What did you come for, a chunk of fire? And I really didn't know what it meant. And later I asked somebody else, I said, what does that mean? And they said, well, if your fire went out at your house, you had to go get fire from somewhere else. And so you would take a bucket or something and you would go to a neighbor and get some coals from them, but you couldn't linger. You had to go right back home. And it's like, So he was saying, your visit's too short. What'd you come for, a chunk of fire? Another one that I always enjoyed, I heard an older woman use it quite often, is she would always say, the longest way is the sweetest way. And that referred to if you were walking with your sweetheart, then the longest way home was the sweetest way home, not the shortest way. And again, I just thought it was an artful, fun little way of it. But it would just slip into a conversation, the longest way is the sweetest way. And then one that I kept hearing in Southwest Virginia a lot, again, in conversation, it would be a suggestion, but it was usually a man, would say, well, if a man had him a bigger shovel, he could dig a hole faster. If a man had him a tractor, he could, it wasn't that nobody had a tractor or had a bigger shovel. It was a way of saying, go get a bigger shovel and we'll get this done faster. But it was always, if a man had then, there was another part of it. But it was almost a pattern of speech rather than a saying or something like that. And then you hear, you just hear fun turns of phrases. One that maybe it's a PG thing on our recording, but I heard a fellow once say, if I ordered a truckload of SOBs and that guy showed up, I'd sign for the whole load. Which I thought, how artful, what a great description. And then he could ruin a one-car funeral. I mean, again, just those kind of phrases of talking about it. I was trying to think of others. I actually have a file of because you hear things and you write them down so that you don't forget them. I always carried a notebook with me when I would make visits, and I wouldn't take it into the visit, but I'd scribble in it as soon as I got back to the car. I'd write it out as quickly as I could, or as much of it as I could remember, because sometimes there were too many wonderful things. And you hate to go back to somebody's house and say, hey, would you say that thing over again so I could get it?